You're listening to Brain Juicer Bites.
So today I'm going to be talking with Sheena Iyengar. Like everybody, your mother must be very proud of you because you've written a book, but not like everybody. You've written a really, really good book that is very interesting. So I know that Goldman Sachs rated it as one of its best books. It was in the top 2 or 3 business books in Amazon. And what it really does is, and I think you brilliantly do this at the beginning, is set up the paradox of choice, which is in some situations, in our Western sense, we're obsessed with having freedom of choice. And yet when you look at your own parents' kind of marriage, this was not a personal choice that either of them made. It was an arranged marriage. And this seems quite unusual to many of us with our Western sensibilities. So I wondered if you wanted to just let us know a little bit more about how arranged marriages can often be so successful.
Well, my parents met each other for the first time on their wedding night. My father didn't even know what my mother looked like because she was covered in a veil during their wedding. So it was a bit of a mystery as to what she was going to turn out to be. And every time when I was growing up, every time I would tell my friends that my parents met each other on their wedding night, they were just horrified. It just sounded like, the kiss of death. But yeah, even now, over 90% of Indians have arranged marriages. They do now get to see the person before they actually get married, but they don't get a whole lot of information either. It's usually 3 or 4 meetings before the decision is made, unlike the case of a love marriage. And it's just a very different setup because, the purpose of the marriage, the expectations from the marriage are just so different. One, the love marriage is based on some kind of soulmate union, a bonding of the minds, whereas the arranged marriage is really about, putting together 2 resumes and saying, look, are these 2 people likely to be compatible and likely to be able to engage in a partnership? And if you look at the 2, first of all, you are comparing apples and oranges. It's a very difficult thing to compare. But if you do try to compare them, essentially what you see is on the day of the wedding, if you ask them how happy they are, you find that the people that are in a love marriage report being happier than the people in an arranged marriage. Now, if you track their happiness over the course of the next 20 years, what you see is that the love marriage, in terms of happiness reporting, is going down. This is the average case, obviously not the outliers, but the average love marriage is going down in terms of happiness. The average arranged marriage is going up in happiness. Now, part of that is coming from the fact that the arranged marriage just starts off at a much lower mean, right? But yeah, essentially, as you in an arranged marriage, as you get used to somebody, kind of like a roommate or your colleague or a business partner, you get used to them. You start to like them. You rely on them. In the love marriage model, right, it's based on that sort of soulmate union status, and right, as time goes on, the everyday chores kind of get in the way of intimacy.
If we take a choice like that, what's amazing about it is effectively you have a social structure, and I think it is that social nature that's important, that allows you to give up making that choice and effectively to hand responsibility for that choice to someone else. Is that very different from where you're denied a choice, where you're not allowed to make your own choice?
I do think it is very different from being denied. Because I don't think people feel that they were denied, right? And I do think that the more young Indians you see, there is now a growing minority of Indians that'll say, look, I will not have an arranged marriage. I will choose my own. And for them, they do conceive of arranged marriage as a denial of their choice. For people like my mom and others that go for arranged marriage, and I have plenty of cousins and other relatives today that do go for arranged marriage, they don't think of it as a denial of choice. They think of it as, this is the way to make the, quote, right choice of whom I will be with, because I'm not capable of making such a really, really consequential decision, which will have ramifications not just for me, but for my entire family. This has to be a jointly made decision in order for it to work out.
If you set a context like that, I mean, one of the interesting ones for me was fairness, and deep in one of your early articles, there was a bit where I think you were looking at people in Eastern Europe about how they made certain choices, and one of them was actually about the number of TV channels, and there was one phrase I remember one of your interviewees, I think, saying, which was about the fairness of choice, and what he said was now they'd come out of this post-communist kind of world, some people now have hundreds of TV channels, and some people have none. And it was that fairness that seemed to make him feel that the context of choice was not one that we could let the market decide perfectly.
Yes, I think what we don't always recognize is that we do have very different visceral ideas about what constitutes the fair allocation of choice in our society. That we somehow believe that whatever our assumptions are about fair choice are universal, and they're not. So that, and this is certainly, it divides people from different cultures. It also divides people within a culture. And one of the ways in which we most see that distinction is between the belief in equal outcome versus equal opportunity, right? So that, some of us really, really believe in our gut that everybody should have the same starting position. And if they don't, you better give them a helping hand. Some of us really, really believe that that's not fair. You remove barriers and you give people equal opportunity, but it's completely fair that some people get more than others because this is a merit-based world.
Okay, and if we took merit, I mean, an interesting one for me, again, listening to some of your stories might be, how do you choose, if we're talking about choice in exactly the same way, how do you choose which of your stories you tell in your books, in your presentations? Because, you now have a very large set of them, and yet you still have to make those choices. So I'm very interested at a personal level how you decide sometimes between things that, to all of us may appear equal.
I guess for me, the way I choose the story is it has to be something which at some level everybody can relate to. Like, I basically feel that if the story can't help everyone in some way, like if there isn't a win-win, then it's probably not worth telling. That's the constraint I put on myself. Because you're right, there's infinite number of stories out there about choice. But I would say that there are stories which are zero-sum, there are stories which are lose-lose, there are stories which are win-win, and my goal is it should be a story which is win-win in its ability to get people to think about the role choice plays in their lives and how they might want to think about how to change the way they think of choice in their life or exercise choosing in their life.
Now, one of the things we've done a lot of work at Brain Juicer is about how emotions drive behavior. How do you think emotions affect the choices we make?
Oh, they affect our choices all the time. They affect us both consciously and subconsciously. We're constantly reacting to our emotions.
And in terms of that context, do you feel we have to be conscious in order to, sorry if I start to sound a bit philosophical, but do we have to have consciously made a choice in order for it to have been a choice? Or if we just say, I don't know, inadvertently told a lie, but we didn't know we were actually lying when we told it, is that not a choice or is that just behavior?
I think that it is that while, yes, the bulk of the decisions we make every day are made subconsciously, we make more choices every day subconsciously than consciously. But I think that to the extent that we want to exercise free will, we do need to be conscious of our priorities. And so that should be the guiding sort of compass, shall we say, for what things we will consciously choose.
Okay. And in the same way, I suppose, I'm just trying to kind of understand, two of the learnings. I mean, one of the things we're often left with is the role of business is to understand human behavior and then to use that behavior to help get the best outcomes. Yeah, that's really what businesses in theory are trying to do. Yet often businesses seem to behave in a way that shows very little understanding of our behavior and do some things that are quite unusual. And I think you've articulated often two of those. The first one is about how much choice. And I think, if you have a sense of learning, it's a bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It's not too much, not too little, just right is the
That's
amount of
right.
choice. And yet businesses persist sometimes in adding choices in a way that's really counterproductive for the people they're trying to deal with.
Yes, that's true, actually. And it's interesting to me how more and more businesses come up to me now and literally tell me that they have seen the numbers and can see that the more choices they're offering or the more SKUs they are offering, they're seeing sales go down. But they're still really, really hesitant and perplexed about where to cut because they're scared they're going to make the wrong cuts.
Yeah. And one of the second ones that is both, from you and also a little bit Barry Schwartz, I think, tongue in cheek, has used this a couple of times, that the secret to happiness is actually about having low expectations. And yet the purpose of choice often is to raise our expectations, the more choice we're given.
So I would disagree with Barry on that. I don't think
Okay.
the secret to happiness is to lower our expectations. I think the secret to happiness is to be choosy about choosing. So that on most things, I will lower my expectations. But I always keep my top priorities. And I keep those top priorities small. But on those top priorities, I will absolutely optimize.
Okay.
And that's where I would strongly disagree with Barry. I think that the things that matter most to me, I want to optimize. And as long as I'm cognizant of the things that don't matter so much to me, I'll satisfice.
Okay. Now, actually, one of the interesting developments in this field recently has been a John Kay's book called Obliquity. And one of the interesting things we've been reading, Obliquity, and trying to understand it, that he articulates is a lot of the things we want most in life, whether that is happiness or seduction, or even in the case of most businesses, profit, are best pursued indirectly rather than directly. And I think to anyone who's ever been into a bar and told an attractive young lady that they'd really want to sleep with them, they would understand that the direct approach was probably the least likely to be successful. How do companies deal with that when they're making their own choices?
I think that the way you frame your goal is important. You should always frame your goal as being something that is in your control, not something that's out of your control. And if you frame your goal as something in your control, you might be more likely to get that which is not directly in your control. And what do I mean by that? If I'm starting a business, my goal should be to produce the very best of whatever it is I'm producing. That's in my control. I can think about that. How do I make this absolutely excellent? How do I get the word out? Now, if I do that well, the uncontrollable goal might also be satisfied, which is profit.
Okay.
Okay, if
Now,
I want this woman to sleep with me in the bar, well, how do I make myself interesting? What does this lady want? You see what I mean?
yeah, absolutely. I suppose the other bit in the context, I suppose, we did, for example, a study at one point with Philips, and they had a $300 coffee machine that they were not really selling very much of, and they were quite disappointed. And we did a certain amount of insight research based on the concept of the machine and its kind of behavior. And in the end, and I can't claim that we recommended this, but in the end, the outcome was that they produced a $600 coffee machine, and the sales of the $300 coffee machine went up 1,500%. When you articulate this to people, they all laugh politely because it sounds so utterly ridiculous. But when we think about choices, effectively what was preventing people choosing that particular coffee machine was it was the most expensive one in the store. And when it stopped being the most expensive one in the store and was, the most expensive of the rest, if you see what I mean, suddenly people started to choose it. How are those contextual things seen, I suppose, both by consumers in a fairness sense? Because when you articulate it to people, they think it, I'm clearly far too intelligent to be manipulated in this way, is what most of us think. And yet those contextual things clearly do influence our behavior every day.
The reason why those contextual things influence your behavior every day is because you don't think through what your preferences are and you act on your emotions. If you essentially walk into if you think about life, every single interaction is a negotiation. So what does that mean? You should be asking yourself, what's my walkaway point? What is it that I really want, and what's my walkaway point? If you know what your walkaway point is, so that means you know what attributes you really want from your coffee machine, well, then the price won't affect you. It'll be all about at what point I get what I want. It's because we don't know what we want that we allow these external cues to manipulate us.
Okay. There was another great David Ogilvy quote, actually, who, if I took specifically about market research for a moment, he said, the trouble with market research is we don't think how we feel, we don't say what we think, and we don't do what we say. Do you think that's very relevant in a choice context?
I actually did a study with these graduating students from undergrad and MBAs, and they were all looking for a job. And I asked them at various points from September until May what they were looking for in a job. And they said one thing in September and another thing in December and another thing in March and another thing yet in May. And then we looked at, who did better in terms of getting more job offers, who was happier with the job offers they got, the people that actually essentially got what they said they were looking for. Well, it turned out, first of all, what they said they wanted in September and what they said they wanted in May was correlated close to zero. So they really changed their minds a lot. Now, does it help to actually get what you originally wanted? Does it help to remember what you originally wanted? Turns out that's not true at all. It's the people who believed that what they got in May was what they wanted all along. They did the best. They had the most job offers. They were happiest. They were more committed to their job. So I've always felt that, the happy people are not the ones who get what they want, but want what they get.
And I think as a life lesson for us all, that's probably a very good point to say thank you very much. That's been fascinating.
Thanks for listening to Brain Juicer Bites. For more about Brain Juicer, visit our website, brainjuicer.com.